The universe of Star Wars stories spans over several different periods of time, or eras of storytelling, in legends and canon, from the Old Republic to the High Republic, the Age of the Empire, the Age of Rebellion, and the Legacy Era, and more. These eras are denoted by time period, but more importantly, the political state of the galaxy, with the Old Republic of Legends, for example, being characterized as during the times of conflict for the Republic, over 1,000 years before the films, whether that conflict be with the Sith, or the Mandalorians, or anyone else. The Jedi were many, and the Sith were many too, and there were lots of conflicts set in this time period. Similarly, the Age of Rebellion in both canon and legends is characterized by taking place before and through the original trilogy, with the Rebel Alliance fighting against the Galactic Empire in the Galactic Civil War, and the prequel trilogy, or Clone Wars period, known in canon as the Fall of the Jedi era, is defined by the Clone Wars conflict and the transformation of the Republic into the Empire. But this transformation, this transition between eras, is where the problem begins with modern Star Wars. And it all centers around Luke Skywalker's Jedi Academy and the canon New Jedi Order. Getting this out of the way, I am a big fan of modern Star Wars canon overall. The Last Jedi is one of my favorite Star Wars movies, even though I grew up as a prequel kid, and I really like the Clone Wars, and I'm also a big fan of the High Republic, so this video is not going to be some sort of ripping and tearing, scathing criticism of canon, but a criticism coming from a fan who is acknowledging flaws in the things that they like. I love the sequels, but they are far from perfect, especially, in my opinion, in the way that they connect to the world of the original trilogy in a few specific ways. But I also need to clarify that I am a huge fan of the old expanded universe, now branded Legends, and that will inform a lot of my discussions. I don't believe in gatekeeping or barriers of entry for being a fan of something, but I think you folks as viewers can benefit from knowing my biases. As the name of the channel suggests, I am trying to centralize Star Wars in a place where discussion is free and open, but nothing is dismissed because of what canon it lies in, or what the perceived general opinion on it is. Anyways, back to the point, the New Republic era of Star Wars canon began shortly after the Battle of Endor, with the establishment of the New Republic from the core of the Rebel Alliance, with the intent of it being the new central government of the galaxy as the Empire's defeat was finally seeming possible. I have talked at length about this time period in previous videos and how it differs from the Legends timeline, and why that is such a big deal for the Star Wars universe. And this video will touch on some similar ideas. The New Republic's establishment and the death of the Emperor was the key transition point between the Age of Rebellion and the New Republic era. This is true in broad strokes in both canon and legends. And that's a big part of what we're going to focus on in this video. The incredibly important transition points between eras and sections in the Star Wars timeline. These transition points are remarkably important for Star Wars as a whole. We see them in prominence all over the timeline. The Battle of Ruusan separating the Old Republic from the Great Peace of the Republic in Legends. The Great Hyperspace War being the first conflict between the Republic and the Sith, also in Legends. The execution of Order 66 ending the Republic and Jedi Order in both timelines. The Yuuzhan Vong invasion at Vector Prime beginning the New Jedi Order era of the Legends timeline. Even the destruction of the Jedi Temple on Ossus in 130 ABY in the Legacy era was a key transition point for the Legends New Jedi Order. These key events are huge parts of Star Wars' galactic history, and thus are very important to get right. If they're skipped over, things can become convoluted rather quickly without proper exploration or perfect execution, which almost happened with the Sith Imperial War in the Legacy era, though thankfully it was explored thoroughly through flashbacks and in the story itself, making the rather confusing introduction get cleared up as future issues released. Like the Legacy era, the Sequel Trilogy also begins with a lot of off-screen development. From the end of Return of the Jedi, we are brought to 34 ABY, 30 years later. Leia leads a new resistance movement, the New Republic has been established off-screen and stagnated off-screen. There is a Cold War going on between it and the new Imperial remnant called the First Order, whose origins we don't know, led by a powerful Force-using Supreme Leader we also don't know, after Luke Skywalker has vanished following the fall of Han and Leia's son to the dark side, and his destruction of Luke's New Jedi Order, causing Han and Leia to separate. Not touching on the subjective quality of these creative choices, we can all objectively say that those are a lot of off-screen developments. especially when compared to the other gap between trilogies, between episodes 3 and 4. Leia, Luke, Yoda, and Obi-Wan, and pretty much everyone else are already in place. The Empire's been formed, the foundations for the rebellion are somewhat laid, and the 19-year gap between episodes 3 and 4 feels nearly seamless. Compared to the gap between episodes 6 and 7, where there are 11 more years and so many more important events that happen off-screen. This gap, the New Republic era, and more importantly, Luke's Jedi Academy, is by far the biggest hole in the Star Wars canon. Now, alone, this isn't explicitly a problem for two reasons. One, as I stated earlier, this can be a wonderful technique of storytelling if these off-screen developments are gradually delved into, which the sequels admittedly do. The events of Luke's exile, Ben's fall, his Order's destruction, and Han and Leia's separation are all actively explored. And this is another area where subjectivity comes into play, because that exploration and justification of these creative choices was enough for many people like me, and I like the sequels because of that. But based on complaints I've seen everywhere for approaching a decade, these justifications weren't always enough for others, which makes sense and makes this gap a glaring issue for many fans. I found Luke's reasoning for his self-imposed exile to be surprising yet compelling and sufficient, but it was widely communicated speaking in the past tense in the film, which is not always sufficient for others who may have found Luke's reasons more sufficient if they had seen his fear and regret grow gradually, shown not told. I personally didn't find that to be an issue with The Last Jedi, but it could be with people's subjective taste. But as described earlier, proper dwelling on these off-screen events could indeed make them feel more believable for some fans, like how they were believable and sufficient for me. But alas, this did not come to pass for some people. Reason 2 that this isn't always a problem is the concept of en media res, the idea of starting a story in its middle for dramatic effect, and sometimes to access the most interesting parts of the story earlier than they would be presented chronologically. This is the entire basis for Lucas beginning with Episode 4, but The Force Awakens, as it is in many ways repeating story beats from the entire original trilogy, ends up repeating this as well. But being the first film after a trilogy gap, this en media res storytelling is out of place in Star Wars. Yes, A New Hope started en media res, but it was brought full circle in Revenge of the Sith. As I described earlier, the transition there is seamless. The Force Awakens, meanwhile, does the same en media res beginning, but in following up another film, leaves us a gigantic gap. These two central reasons might justify other Star Wars stories beginning their stories after a lot of off-screen events, but not everyone feels this way about the sequels. But what I want to do here is to try to build a bridge. Not between episodes 6 and 7, but between views on the sequels. Sure, there are lots of invalid criticisms of the sequels based in bigotry, but there are also some very valid storytelling complaints. Between fans who hate the sequels because of their narrative events, and fans that love the sequels and want to see them built up to and expanded upon, I think there is common ground to be found in the fact that the 30-year gap between episodes 6 and 7 is a huge hole. It's the chasm of canon, the canyon of continuity, and where the most important untold story is yet to be told. Luke Skywalker's Jedi Academy. So, establishing some background, what do we actually know about this time period in canon? Let's lay it out in super broad strokes. The Galactic Civil War ends at the Battle of Jakku, after 1 year of Operation Cinder, which I also made a huge video about and you should go check out. That's in 5 ABY, 1 year after Episode 6, and thus begins the peace of the New Republic. I put peace in quotes because there were definitely still conflicts here, some even involving the New Republic, but they were either dealt with on a local basis or simply weren't to the scale of needing any kind of real militarization, as during this period the New Republic had demilitarized, and as mentioned earlier, promoted local defense forces. In this way, the New Republic was still in control, but in a more hands-off way. They controlled the majority of the galaxy. During this time, Leia was a senator, Han ran a racing team and a shipping company, and the two had a son named Ben, who went off to train with Luke. Lando had a daughter who was eventually kidnapped, Chewbacca returned to his family, and Luke began a training temple on the ancient Jedi library world of Ossus. There, Luke trained Grogu, along with countless other students and his nephew Ben, who was gradually slipping to the dark side and hearing voices in his head. Luke's first class eventually reaching the age where they could start training younger students themselves, leading to a healthy but busy new Jedi Order. Organized crime also grew in a few areas due to both the New Republic's lax attitude and secret funding from Imperial remnants that were slowly reorganizing themselves into the First Order. This came to a T in 28 ABY, a year kinda well explored in books and comics, as Leia is ousted from the Senate upon the revelation that her father was Darth Vader, and also Ben Solo's complete fall to the dark side following him learning this information for the first time, and Luke witnessing Ben's future dark deeds and reacting by igniting his lightsaber. But these events, especially those with Ben, just absolutely feel like the end of a story. Yes, it is the beginning of Kylo Ren, but it's also the end of Ben Solo, a character we don't really know that well. And I'm saying that as a huge fan of Ben Solo. We know the broad strokes, but we don't really see his gradual slipping into darkness that Luke mentions in Episode 8, except in a few moments in the Rise of Kylo Ren comics, which are pretty much the only canon story we have surrounding Luke's academy, and almost all through flashbacks at that. I think a lot more people would come around to Ben's fall and Luke's sad actions that fateful night if the slow process of Ben's corruption was seen rather than told. Again, I'm not saying Episode 8 doesn't work for me, as it does, and I personally found the telling and flashback to be completely sufficient. I love The Last Jedi, and who wouldn't want a well-done prequel to something that they love? Now let's step into Star Wars Legends. With no sequel trilogy, the timeline there, beyond Return of the Jedi, is carried by widely books. Truce at Bakura, the Thrawn Trilogy, the Callista Trilogy, which I will always defend, the X-Wing series, the Black Fleet Crisis, the Almanian Uprising, the Corellian Crisis, Hand of Thrawn, and more, not to mention the 19-book-long mega-series, The New Jedi Order, and its 2 9-book-long follow-ups, Legacy of the Force and Fate of the Jedi. From the death of the Emperor to 45 ABY, the story of Legends post-Endor is dense. And you might say that this is just because of the sheer amount of years it took to fill this time period in. And you'd be right in claiming that, but that's not what we're arguing. You see, Ben Solo in canon is not the first Solo son to turn to the dark side. Years earlier, there was Jacen Solo, first appearing literally born with his twin sister Jaina in The Last Command, the Thrawn Trilogy's 3rd book. Jacen's entire life is explored in Star Wars Legends. We see him as an infant in Dark Empire, as a toddler in the Jedi Academy trilogy, growing up a little more in the Crystal Star, through the Corellian trilogy, all the way up to his teenage years at Luke's Academy in the Young Jedi Knights books, and even into late adolescence and early adulthood in the Yuuzhan Vong War of the New Jedi Order series, then becoming a father in the Dark Nest trilogy, and finally fully falling to the dark side and, spoilers I guess, yeah, that's old enough, dying in the Legacy of the Force books. The most comparable conflict in Legends to the First Order Resistance War in canon is probably the Second Galactic Civil War, in that very same Legacy of the Force series. The Solo son falls, and a second civil war happens in the galaxy, though it's short-lived, although canon brings in a lot of elements of Dark Empire as well. But all the events of Legacy of the Force are spurred on by Jacen's turn to the dark side, which, when looked at as a whole, had its seeds likely, but kinda unintentionally, planted years earlier in the New Jedi Order books, and was expanded upon in the Dark Nest trilogy. Legends densely explored Jacen Solo's characterization, and regardless of your opinion on what happened, I don't think it can be denied that it was a smooth transition. Legends was dense, but these characters appeared, therefore, densely. So if they wanted to make a character develop slowly but steadily, which they didn't always want to do, they could. And this was the case for Jacen's characterization. I mean, look at this chart I made of all of the Legends books versus canon books taking place in the New Republic era. This is a huge difference, and the fall to the dark side of a Solo child is not a simple feat, and jumping into the story with the Solo child already fallen to the dark side left a lot to be desired for some. We know he was a Jedi, a good guy for a long time, and we skip that. Even those who like the sequels want to see good guy Ben Solo before Kylo Ren. That's not to say Kylo Ren was a lackluster character, as he definitely wasn't. He's a great character. But what's missing is any semblance of who he was before Kylo Ren, and I think that's kind of a shame. We're told it and communicated it non-verbally, but we need to know Ben Solo. In early 2022, Luke Skywalker's Jedi Academy made an incredibly surprising appearance in the Book of Boba Fett of all places, where Din Djarin visits Ossus in search of his son Grogu. The little green guy is being trained by Luke there, while the first structure of his temple is being built rock by rock, and is later seen completed. This presumably became Luke's base of operations for the following years, as he further prepared to take classes of students. In 15 ABY, Ben Solo and a dozen other students began the initial class at Luke's Jedi Academy. They trained, and they were Jedi Knights. This temple and this reborn Jedi Order lasted from 15 ABY to 28 ABY for 13 years, and we know that by 21 ABY, when Ben was 16, he was considered a much more senior pupil and was gaining more responsibility in the Order. This is really the last that we know of Ben before the night he destroyed Luke's temple, even if he only kind of destroyed it. And this is the hole I'm talking about. We know such basics, barely anything specific from this time period. A new generation of Jedi Knights, Ben, Hennix, Vo, Tai, and more, all training under Jedi Master Luke Skywalker, and presumably going on missions. Over this 13-year time period, Ben Solo grew more powerful, but more distant, the darkness inside of him increasing. And Luke notices this. The dark side grew inside Jacen Solo in the same way, and Luke also noticed in Legends. Why can't that same type of story be told in canon? This matters because so many people see Luke's split-second decision to ignite his lightsaber over a sleeping Ben Solo as such a terrible creative choice, while seeing the context of that ignition, of that decision and that night, could help people understand the true nuance the situation almost certainly actually included. Nuance that was communicated to me through the film, but it didn't necessarily work for others. Luke didn't do that out of nowhere. He said he had seen darkness in Ben in moments during his training, and likely couldn't talk to him about it in any reasonable way, resorting to looking into his mind and seeing his future plans. What Luke did wasn't good, but it was also on top of over a decade of personal training of Ben. A decade of interpersonal context led to that moment. Luke witnessed his growing darkness, and telling a story set at Luke's academy could absolutely give us that sweet, sweet context that feels kind of left out from the sequels. Think about it, so many of the important off-screen events that happened before the sequels all take place during this period and could be shown rather than simply spoken about. But now I need to address the Mantelian Savrip in the room. Yes, you, not the Dejeric piece, the actual Savrip. Movies should not only work with the asterisk of having to read a book or comic or watch a TV show. We have to establish that. If a movie has required reading, that's a failure on the film's part. But then again, devil's advocate, this is kinda what happened with the prequels. Kinda. For years, the prequels were vehemently hated by what seemed to be the majority of Star Wars fans. Then, as the 2000s rolled into the 2010s, things shifted. Yes, fans of the prequels grew up, and I think that's a huge part of it. But also, these fans of the prequels grew up with the Clone Wars. And the Clone Wars supported these films immensely. The influence of the Clone Wars on the general image of the prequels cannot be understated. It's regarded by many fans as nearly essential viewing for understanding the full prequel-era story. But what I think really happened here is that the Clone Wars gave the prequels a little more context. The show didn't fix the movies, they're still the same movies. It just changed how people saw them. Gave them a little bit more information that made them rethink the movies and adjust their opinions on them. The Clone Wars is not necessary to understand the prequels, but it certainly can help one enjoy them or see value in them. Attack of the Clones doesn't end with an asterisk, and Episode 3 doesn't start with one telling you to watch the Clone Wars to get the story. It's not completely necessary, but it causes one to reflect on those movies and realize what they were truly trying to say. Probably the biggest off-screen change featured in the sequels, and one that received quite an intense reaction from fans and still does to this day, is the previously mentioned change of attitude of Luke Skywalker in The Last Jedi, compared to the last time we really spent time with him in Return of the Jedi. In comparison to that, every character at the end of Revenge of the Sith, the other trilogy ender leading into a gap, is placed perfectly in line with where they will show up in A New Hope. This isn't true in the slightest for the original's sequels gap, and again, I don't think this is necessarily a problem. For me, it makes The Last Jedi a compelling, complicated, and subversive film that has a lot to say about how we view heroes. And I think the plot explains away Luke's change of heart and grown cynicism in a beautiful way. But many people also didn't feel this way. And I think people that liked Luke's depiction in The Last Jedi, and those that also didn't, would both be willing to see a version of Luke that gradually gets there over the course of the era, either because they already like the story, or because they want to see more justification for where he ends up. I just think that there's a fascinating story to tell about Luke Skywalker, burdened with the legacy of the Jedi Order, trying his best to train a dozen students while also preserving Jedi history and recruiting more. Running a Jedi Academy. The main character of the original trilogy, one of the most iconic fictional characters of all time, training a new generation of Jedi. Who wouldn't want this? And again, I'm not saying these stories would be necessary for the sequels to work, but like the Clone Wars and the prequels, these stories could make people see the sequels as they truly are, in a different light than they're used to. But this wouldn't be the very beginning. Though not all about Luke's Academy and Ben Solo, post-Episode 9 Star Wars stories have indeed begun exploring the New Republic era of Star Wars in live action. The Mandalorian, The Book of Boba Fett, Ahsoka, and eventually Skeleton Crew, all exploring this time period and doing little bits of world building that lead up to the sequels. The Mandalorian has now heavily explored the New Republic's presence in the Outer Rim, and how they were pretty hands-off, while also definitively featuring Luke Skywalker as the herald of the Jedi during this period, along with Ahsoka, which absolutely told a somewhat New Republic-centric story, showing us demilitarization, the Defense Force, and even some actual government operations, like The Mandalorian Season 3. All of this seemingly leading to the somewhat stagnant New Republic we hear about but don't see in the sequels. Meanwhile, the Book of Boba Fett, as previously mentioned, for some reason, has given us our best look at Luke's temple so far. We see the construction of the initial hut of Luke's Jedi Academy, and the Jedi Master training Grogu in the series. This shows that they haven't forgotten about this idea. But the era has also been explored off-screen, at least minimally. The book timeline that I showed earlier for this period absolutely depicts how minimal that is. 4 to 5 ABY is well covered by at least 8 books, the Alphabet Squadron and Aftermath trilogies, Lost Stars and Princess and the Scoundrel, and one comic series, Shattered Empire. Then we've got a little gap with no official stories set in 6 ABY, but one flashback from the Poe comics and a flash forward in the Vader comics depicting this year, the Vader one showing Luke finding Jocasta Nu's stash of holocrons that he uses to start his new Jedi Order. Then the next year, we have the wonderfully weird Last Shot by Daniel Jose Older, which is a Han and Lando team-up book about them fighting a mad scientist from both of their pasts who's trying to make all droids murderous during the New Republic era. This book establishes some New Republic politics really well, gives Lando his love interest, who's presumably the mother of his child, and deals with Han wanting to be a good dad for Ben. Great stuff. From there, we have nothing until the events of the New Republic era Disney Plus series, which have somehow all been crammed into 9 ABY, which I find pretty hard to believe. Then in the following years, we know details about births and deaths, and Luke restarting the Jedi, but we have literally no stories actually taking place from 10 to 17 ABY in canon. 7 years! This is an unprecedented gap that could contain some actually incredible Star Wars stories that are just missing. At least we can assume the Thrawn story that the Disney Plus shows are building up to happens in this era, but knowing Lucasfilm, that'll probably still be in 9 ABY. I'm half joking there. After this chunk, from 18 to 19 ABY, the young adult novel Poe Dameron Freefall by Alex Segura happens. And this book has some really great New Republic world building in it, but it's not much of a statement on the state of the galaxy, though it is a great story. In 19 ABY, we have a few flashbacks, and we know Luke fights the Knights of Ren on Elphrona this year, but nothing super substantial. 20 ABY is another year where literally no stories take place. And the next year, 21 ABY, we get Shadow of the Sith by Adam Christopher. An island in an endless darkness in the great chasm of canon. Can you tell I really like this book? Shadow of the Sith is the story of Jedi Master Luke, who is busy training generations of students, and an older Lando who is depressed after the loss of his young daughter, trailing the Jedi hunter Ochi of Bastoon as he attempts to track down a young Rey and her parents for the Sith Eternal. This book basically takes all of the off-screen events that The Rise of Skywalker introduced in any way, shape, or form and spins them into a galaxy-spanning, Legends-style romp with some amazing development for the legacy characters. Just a wonderful book. It gives us a good look at the New Republic, some hints at the foundation of the First and Final Orders, and a pretty good glimpse into Luke's academy and how it runs. The book makes it seem like a pretty big operation, too. Then, following Shadow of the Sith, we go back into the dark. We get really scant stories, other than Brendel Hux's crash onto the planet Parnassos, where he meets and recruits Captain Phasma into the First Order, which was fully formed by this point and in waiting for their eventual reveal years later. We have one single comic issue detailing Rose and Paige Tico's backstory, set in 26 ABY, 0 stories set in 27 ABY, but we do know that Poe joins the New Republic Academy this year, and 28 ABY is where the events of Bloodline and the main story of the rise of Kylo Ren take place. In Bloodline, Leia investigates a criminal organization that ends up being tied to the First Order, and in Rise of Kylo Ren, Ben falls to the dark side. Luke's temple is destroyed, and Ben is hunted down by a group of remaining students, and they all die in the process, with him killing the final student in order to fully join the Knights of Ren. Oh, and Ben knew Snoke way before he fell to the dark side. And based on some lines in The Force Awakens, it seems that Han and Leia know of him too.
No, it was Snoke. He seduced our son to the dark side, but we can still save him.
And in a quote in The Rise of Kylo Ren, Snoke implies that Luke gave him these scars. But this is probably a lie considering the pickled Snokes in Episode 9 already have their scars, but still. So many questions. This time period between 15 and 28 ABY is literally ripe and fertile for incredible storytelling involving the New Republic, the Knights of Ren, the reborn Jedi Order, the main characters of the original trilogy, and arguably the most popular character from the sequels, Ben Solo. Not to mention the 6-year-long Cold War period immediately following this, which has indeed been chronicled by parts of sequel-related media like the Poe Dameron comics, but is still underdeveloped, especially on the political side. We don't really even have a story depicting the secession of New Republic worlds to form the political base of the First Order. But back to Legends again. The landmark New Jedi Order series begins in 25 ABY in that timeline. The Solo twins are 16, and their younger brother Anakin is 14. And by this point, 1999, these kids' stories have been chronicled in years of books and the occasional comic. Now, just like how I think the sequels can and should stand on their own without any other media being necessary to support them, the New Jedi Order can do this itself. I read NJO for the first time without having read any other New Republic era EU stuff except for the original Thrawn trilogy. I missed 16 years, and it still worked beautifully. Just like how, in my opinion, the sequels skip 30 years and it still works perfectly as well. But man, the New Jedi Order absolutely blows the sequel trilogy out of the water. I love both, but NJO is on another level. And even though NJO totally works without knowing the 21 years that have passed since Return of the Jedi, learning about those events, as I am right now with my Bantam era reread, has retroactively made the 19-book mega series even better. I think this is where the sequels need to do their legwork from now on. And it's already kinda happening. The Mandalorian and The Bad Batch are great examples already of connections being made to the events of the sequels in a way that makes it feel like it all flows together. Just pull a reverse NJO for canon. Whereas NJO was the payoff and culmination to almost a decade of EU stories that had been published over the course of the 90s, The sequels need to do this retroactively. Make the sequels retroactively pay off the entire New Republic era. That can be really easy if done right. Show us the foundations of the First Order even more than you have been. Show us Luke's order so we feel more when we see it go. Show us Ben Solo's fall and how much his family loved him so we feel that loss that we're shown in the sequels. It already works there for me. It does. But knowing what happened in between and getting to first-hand experience that emotional context would be incredible. Just like, yes, we understood what happened to Anakin Skywalker based on context clues and dialogue from the original trilogy. But seeing it in the prequels makes it hurt so much more, and Star Wars has a chance to do that again. Young Jedi Knights was a series of young adult novels by Kevin J. Anderson and Rebecca Moesta that Star Wars released between 1995 and 1998. Sorry to make some people feel old, or to date myself, but that's before I was born. Beloved by fans of the EU, these books chronicle Jacen and Jaina Solo's first 2 years as official students living and training at Luke Skywalker's Jedi Praxium on Yavin 4. The books contain a wide variety of colorful characters that we get to know and love across the 14 books of the series, as Jacen, Jaina, and co. become young Jedi Knights. New Jedi Order works well enough without having read these books, but having read them makes it a whole different story. And especially in Edge of Victory 1, Conquest, where the Jedi Praxium is destroyed by the Yuuzhan Vong. In the NJO alone, this wonderful Jedi Academy is destroyed and it's so sad. But after experiencing the Young Jedi Knight series, it's devastating. This is the emotional power the sequels could capture if they leaned into this era of storytelling. Make this an absolutely heart-shattering shot, as we see the temple that we now know well burning to the ground, instead of just relying on Mark Hamill's incredible performance to communicate that emotion. In fact, similar to how Alec Guinness's performance in Episode 4 when reminiscing about Luke's father was later made so much deeper with the knowledge of everything he was actually reflecting on, telling the story of Luke's Jedi Academy could give Mark's performance in Episode 8 a whole different dimension. What Star Wars needs for this time period is an animated series about Luke's Jedi Academy. Call it Star Wars Jedi Academy, Star Wars Skywalker Academy, or even Star Wars Young Jedi Knights if that works. I mean, they did it for Tales of the Jedi. Feature Ben Solo heavily, but also make it more of an anthology series so we could get some episodes about Ben, some about Luke, or even Leia and Han. Some about Vo, Hennix, Ty, Enyo, Streen, Dorsk81, whoever they want. Have Ben and his fellow students grow up over the course of the seasons. Imagine if the show ran for as long as the Clone Wars and how much we'd be able to see Ben Solo grow up. Feature the Knights of Ren, adapt Shadow of the Sith, slowly introduce Snoke, show us the New Republic at its height. To me it seems like so much of a goldmine of a concept that it surprises me that they haven't done anything like this. Especially after giving us such a good soft entry into the story in the Book of Boba Fett. Now on that topic, if they do a live-action series on this topic with deepfake Luke Skywalker, I will be heartbroken because that is so dumb, stilted, and borderline unethical. Also, Mark Hamill is still around. Get him to voice Luke while we've still got him. We know he can voice act. One of the main goals of the sequel trilogy was to pass the torch from the original trilogy heroes to the younger generation. Overall, in canon, while this was done, I don't think it was done perfectly. I love the sequels, even The Rise of Skywalker. Yes, I think that's a great movie. But they absolutely all have flaws, and one of them is feeling just a bit too disconnected from the OT, especially when compared to the prequels in the OT. I think this theoretical animated series that I'm proposing could absolutely solve this problem for some critics of the sequels, while building up to them in a respectful way for fans of the sequels. Make the transition smooth, and tell some great stories. We've seen little hints at it in the LEGO Star Wars specials too. Yes, we know what the Academy's eventually fiery end will be, but look at the Clone Wars. Order 66 caps off that era, and it's horrible, and the clones and Jedi are both hurt immensely by it. Yet that series is still beloved by fans, even knowing the demise that awaits the characters. Why not do the same here? have a more fun, lighthearted vibe with young Ben and his friends that gets darker and deeper as the kids who start watching it grow up, ending with Ben's fall, or even going beyond it as we see Luke maybe try to get Ben back before exiling himself, with Ben maybe hunting down the few surviving students. The story is just begging to be told in animation for me. I love the sequels, and have been able to fill in their obvious gaps in my mind, but I would love to see them filled in real stories the same way the prequels did that for the originals. I know a lot of people don't like the sequels, and that's also okay. Maybe this could change their minds, maybe not. But Star Wars stories are far legitimized by full connectivity. Kathleen Kennedy, please do this. Thanks for joining me on this journey. My reading recommendation for today is The Rise of Kylo Ren comics by Charles Soule and Will Sliney. It's the story of the days or weeks following that fateful night where Luke's temple was destroyed. It's great and a little weird, and hopefully will someday be regarded as our first dip into the long story of Luke's Jedi Academy.